Good morning, good evening, wherever you are. I hope you're all staying safe and healthy. Welcome to the Voices of Sustainability virtual fireside chat series. My name is Tanzeed Alam. I'm the Managing Director of Earth Matters Consulting. We're based in the UAE, but with work happening around the region, in the Gulf region and Europe and the UK. The Zayed Sustainability Prize was established in 2008 as the United Arab Emirates' pioneering global award for recognizing organizations and high schools for their sustainable, innovative, and humanitarian solutions. Today, the prize counts 15 years of global impact, with 378 million people around the world benefiting from its winners' solutions across the categories of health, food, energy, water, climate action, and global high schools inspired by the Sustainable Development Goals. In honor of Earth Day, with its 2023 theme, Invest in Our Planet, today's episode has brought together an esteemed panel of guest speakers, well suited to delve into a discussion about how we should invest in our planet to drive equitable, inclusive, sustainable development. But first, I would like to introduce our guest speakers. We have William Asiko, who's the Vice President with the African Regional Office for the Rockefeller Foundation. Welcome, William. We also have Anjali Bansal, founding partner of Avaana Capital. Welcome, Anjali. We're delighted to have you all with us today, and I'm excited to hear your thoughts. So we have 3 rounds of questions that I would like to start off first with William, if I may. What are the most pressing climate-related challenges that African countries are currently facing? Do you feel existing climate finance arrangements are equipped to provide money at the pace required to address these challenges? So 2 questions there. I hope you can have a go at answering those. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tanzeem, and thank you to the Zayed Sustainability Prize for having me on this show. First of all, I think this is a very relevant topic today. I think we are all talking about climate change, and it is impacting us all in different ways. I think for Africa, given that this is largely an agricultural economy-driven continent, most countries have well over 60 to 70% of their economies driven by agriculture. The way climate change is manifesting and affecting most of us is disruption of weather patterns. So increasing intensity in whether it's dry seasons or wet seasons, whether it's hot or cold, and increasing unpredictability of the seasons. Now, nearly 80% of the agriculture on the African continent is rain-fed. So you can begin to immediately see the impact that climate change is having on the continent. Never a day goes by where you don't hear a story of either extreme drought, perhaps in the the Horn of Africa has been particularly hard hit with this. And then on the other extremes, Cyclone Freddy recently in Mozambique, Madagascar Reunion has caused havoc with huge amounts of rain, flooding, and other problems. And so the way this is manifesting is uncertainty and unpredictability in weather, which is negatively impacting agricultural production. And we're also seeing an increased disease burden on the health of populations driven by climate change. So heat stress, where you have drought and an increasing heat, and then of course waterborne diseases where you have increased rain and stagnant water and flooding. So these are the ways that we are being affected. Now, of course, climate finance has been a topic that has long been on the agenda of African leaders and African activists, especially at the COP meetings, is how do you redress the imbalance of Africa being a small emitter and sort of one of the larger or more impacted sufferers of climate change. I think there are a number of issues here that we must understand. Obviously, the fiscal space of African governments is very tight for a number of reasons, and that was the case even before COVID, and even before the geopolitical issues in Europe, and even before the climate crisis. So those three issues have made the fiscal space even worse for African countries. So finding money for adaptation and mitigation is extremely difficult for African countries. And the finance that is flowing to Africa from global development banks, from global North countries, is a mere 3% of all global finance around climate finance that is available. And so Africa is falling way behind in terms of the finance mechanisms that are available to deal with climate change. And this is something for which we must find a solution. Thanks, Tanzeed.
Excellent. Thank you, William. And we can pick up on some of those challenges that you mentioned about why finance isn't flowing to Africa, and really like to explore that a bit more. But I'd like to go on next to Anjali, kind of related to this point. How important is the role of climate finance in bridging the gap to effectively address the impacts of climate change and accelerate the uptake of climate and eco-innovation?
Tanzeed, thank you, and thanks to the Sustainability Prize for having me here on the show. I think there are so many things packed in that question. One is, why is the need for climate finance? And if we break that up and apply it a little bit in some ways to the global south, so think about mitigation, which is reduction in carbon and GHG gases, and so emission reduction for the most part is mitigation. But in the global south, where a large part of the world lives and where most of us live really and work, the adaptation and resilience, so supporting the transition from a high carbon growth pathway to a lower carbon growth pathway, and protecting very vulnerable populations. Again, these part of the world, we have fragmented markets, we have small businesses, economies that are still much more agrarian. We actually sit on about 60% of the world's scope 3 in Asia itself, with all the manufacturing here. So there is a need to recognize a broad-based approach to financing, not just mitigation and reduction, emission reduction, but also supporting the adaptation and transition financing, as well as building resilience in vulnerable populations. So when we think about this in the Indian context, we have three sectors that constitute about 90% of emissions. And that's largely around energy transition, supply chain and mobility, and climate resilient agriculture. That's where Avaana invests as well. So it's 90% of emissions, but also 70% of the economy. So one way to think about climate financing is it's not merely aid that is flowing from either the north or the west to the other parts of the world, but it's really a big market opportunity. As economic systems and social systems transition from high carbon to low carbon growth pathways, the reality is our part of the world will continue to grow from a GDP point of view. We want to see 6 to 8% year-on-year GDP growth over the next 20-25 years. We want to bring 200 million people out of poverty. So there will be first an increased consumption of steel, cement, power. 60% of our power is coal-based. So hard to abate industries, first, there will be an increase before it actually starts reducing. A lot of new infrastructure has to be built. 75% of the buildings that will exist in 2047, which is when India turns 100, don't exist today. So much of new infrastructure to be built, we might as well get it built right. So this is actually yes, it's a big problem statement. Climate action, change is impacting all of us every day, socially as well as materially. From a business system point of view, we can see climate risks coming into credit underwriting. Cost of capital for companies that do not demonstrate responsibility, cost of capital is actually much higher for them. And so we are seeing large corporates, large industry move down net zero commitments and start working on that. We are seeing governments make net zero commitments, and certainly society is becoming a lot more aware. And consequently, there is both a need as well as an opportunity for innovation financing, transition and adaptation financing to help make this transition happen.
Excellent. Thank you, Anjali. William, if I may, it's I wanted to pick up on that point you mentioned about why only 3% of climate finance is going towards African countries. Can you elaborate on that a little bit more? I think that's really important for the audience to understand why only 3%.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. And that's an important point. And I just want to pick up, I think it's a really good segue, a point that Anjali just made about, companies making commitments to net zero, governments making commitments to net zero. I think the idea of financial flows is very greatly aligned with investment. I think what many African countries have done is very much lead with the argument of loss and damage. And loss and damage is very important. I think that given that Africa and largely the global north have been very low emitters and seem to be suffering a disproportionate amount of damage, loss and damage is important. But I think that there is a huge opportunity to also talk about potential for investment. I think a lot of the reasons why the financial flows remain low is because they're dependent on the generosity of global north countries. They're dependent on the generosity of taxpayers in global north countries. And we know that in today's current space, that generosity is dwindling. Countries in the global north are reducing funding for development outside of their countries. And so, you will find that it is very difficult to make loss and damage arguments, as we have seen over the past 10 years in COP. I'm not suggesting at all that we should take, loss and damage any less seriously. That definitely should be pushed. But I think there is an opportunity to lead with investment opportunities. Now, many of the companies that Anjali talked about that are making net zero commitments that are based in the global north will be unable to get to net zero unless they make fundamental shifts in their manufacturing practices. And some of them may need to shift their manufacturing totally from global north locations to global south, where you have plenty of natural resources that can help them achieve net zero. And I don't think that we in Africa have done enough to package those opportunities for investment, for industry to go green, if you want. I think that's a huge opportunity. It would be a win-win for the planet. It would be a win-win for Africa in the sense that you get inward flows of investment, private sector investment capital, job creation, and so on. So I think that is certainly one factor. I think another factor is the global architecture, the architecture of the global financial mechanisms. I think today you find that largely global South countries, both in Asia and here in Africa, are paying a premium for the perceived risk that even multilateral development banks, but even private sector banks place on lending to these countries. And so, whereas global north countries will raise funding for climate and other development issues or investment issues at 0.5 to 3%, many African countries are paying double-digit figures from 10 to 15% for the same capital from the same lenders. And I think that is also a challenge. So I do think that there are some structural issues that are affecting those financial flows. But I do think that we have an opportunity, especially here in Africa, to be more forthright about investment opportunities, about how Africa can be a champion of climate action rather than just simply a victim of climate action. So I'd really want to emphasize that point, that we do have opportunities to increase. There are things we don't control here in Africa about the global financial architecture. We'll talk a little bit about what we are doing about it at the Rockefeller Foundation in the next round of questions.
Excellent, thank you. And I really appreciate that comprehensive response, William. So actually, we can now go on to the next round of questions. And William, it's a question you mentioned about, you actually anticipated this about what's the Rockefeller Foundation doing in this space. So how is the foundation supporting countries and communities in Africa to build climate resilience while ensuring that low-cost capital is accessible for local climate innovations and solutions?
Yes, so thank you. I mean, we recognize at the Rockefeller Foundation that, in the middle of COVID and the COVID pandemic, it was clear that the world was not going to go back to pre-COVID times. I think, we had seen several shocks. I think we were seeing high food prices already before COVID. The fiscal space was tightening. And I think many communities, vulnerable communities, were already experiencing the ravages of climate change. And so, when the pandemic came with all its socioeconomic impacts, and then the geopolitical issues in Europe, it was just clear that we were never going to go back to pre-COVID days. And so at the Rockefeller Foundation, we started a body of work called Global Economic Recovery. And the Global Economic Recovery simply looks at largely countries in the Global South and what it is that they can do to change some of the parameters that are affecting them. So I talked about the global financial architecture, which is today, as it is designed, is stacked up against poor countries. It is stacked up against Global South countries. Global South countries are paying higher interest rates. They have a perceived risk. The capital available to them is less and less. And as we saw, many countries are also reducing their development finance. At the same time, these same countries are facing mounting debt, not because they have borrowed inappropriately, but because the interest rates they are paying are punitive, to be honest. And so these two factors mean that capital is unavailable. So one of the things we've done is we have partnered with Prime Minister Mia Mottley of Barbados. And we've worked with her and other partners along maybe peer foundations and other countries now, develop what has now come to be called the Bridgetown Initiative. And the Bridgetown Initiative is really calling on the reform of the global financial architecture, the reform of multilateral development banks to release capital, more capital to climate vulnerable island states, but also to debt-stricken African and Global South countries to deal with the ravages of climate change, to fund adaptation, just energy transitions Anjali talked about. So we do need to find that. And the Bridgetown Initiative looks at all these things and how African countries can benefit from them. So what we're doing at the Rockefeller Foundation is we're pushing African countries to get onto this agenda, to be pushing for this reform, because the more countries that add their voice to this agenda around Bridgetown, around multilateral development bank reform, the stronger the voice will be, and the more that our multilateral development banks, our captains of the world's banks will listen, and we can get some reform. We've also established a global energy alliance for people and planet that is working around supporting countries with the just energy transition, supporting countries with their adaptation and mitigation, and supporting countries with connections around renewable energy. And then lastly, as a source of finance, we're also looking at new areas that maybe African countries have not developed. So we recently at COP27 launched the African Carbon Markets Initiative. This is a platform that brings together different actors along the carbon markets value chain, from developers to countries to buyers, all right, and verifiers. We've established a steering committee. We and other partners have put together a fund of nearly $10 million to initiate the engine room of the African Carbon Markets Initiative to get it functional. The idea is to establish a platform that is going to be independent and that countries, developers, and buyers can feel confident in, to develop a brand of African carbon markets. It is estimated that the market, and these are conservative estimates, that the market for African carbon markets is in, upwards of $30 billion in the next 3 years. And so this can be a new source of finance for not just for countries, but also for communities, because the project developers where these carbon credit projects are being conducted will also benefit from them, which is the model of ACME. I'll stop there, but those are some of the things that we're doing. Thank you, Tanzeed.
Thank you, William. That sounds all really exciting and really interesting work. So thank you for sharing all those examples. And now, Anjali, you mentioned some really interesting points in your opening remarks in the first round. Obviously there's many different types of financial instruments, but can you provide a few examples of innovative financial instruments and approaches that are successfully fostering climate innovation and delivering on the ground?
So we require all the full stack financing solution for climate. We require equity. We require particularly initially grant funding and R&D funding when it comes to science and science-based innovation that happens in labs and both corporate labs as well as universities. And that is something that governments, foundations, William mentioned GAP. So we've had some opportunity to work with GAP as well here. I think a lot of the research and development that goes into science to create climate solutions is important. At the same time, equity is also very important because equity creates enterprises. And we see this, and I mentioned earlier, large companies and countries are all making net zero commitments, but we know that a lot of those solutions may not necessarily come from large companies, particularly in the hard to abate sectors. So there is a need to bridge that, the innovation gap that exists to solve for whether it is energy transition, it is charging infrastructure, it is the new format of carbon markets, it's scope 3 measurement, which is very difficult to do. It's climate resilient agriculture, regenerative agriculture. So all of those things that actually come out of, in some ways, not just in the lab, but commercialization of new technology requires equity financing. We see enough financing available for now renewable energy projects, for example. So that space has matured. There is a lot of mainstream money available for it at very good rates, both equity and debt. And then of course, a third part of the capital stack is debt. So you need a continuous flow of working capital, of CapEx, of project financing required in water, in energy, in agriculture to help scale up some of these solutions. So across the board, we need the developmental capital, the catalytic capital, such as the one that Rockefeller Foundation provides. We need collaboration. We need working across equity and debt. And in particular, we need to bring together the ecosystems of technology innovation, large companies, which is where adoption at scale happens, policymakers, and policy is a significant enabler in this space, as well as catalytic capital.
Thank you, Anjali. And you mentioned that importance of systemic change, essentially, in your comments there. If I could ask you one follow-up question on that, because you talked about equity and the importance of that, which is really crucial. In your experience, how can you ensure that the most vulnerable communities actually get some of the money as a result of the solutions being implemented?
I think if you think about population scale change, and in large population countries such as India, vulnerable populations will get a lot of the required financing in different ways. So again, that is why we need different types of instruments. William talked about the multilateral development banks and the need to kind of do some reform there. I would say not even reform, we just need new products. We need products which then now take the leap forward and recognize climate action, innovation, and create, just like we did with microfinance. I was involved with microfinance in the last 25, 30 years. Microfinance was very innovative. It broke up the traditional paradigm of a loan and said small loan at the doorstep without physical collateral, using social capital as collateral, right? So highly innovative product, very different ways of distribution. Similarly, we have to think about innovative products, equity, debt, and insurance. I didn't talk about insurance as much earlier, but we need insurance products as well, so that the vulnerable populations and vulnerable communities can get access to them. At the same time, you're able to drive capital from an investment and returns perspective, as well as developmental social perspective.
Excellent, thank you, Anjali. You mentioned microfinance, which is something close to my heart. I'm originally from Bangladesh, so I know
there you go, Tanzeed.
And the work that they did, so it's really interesting you mentioned that.
No, I was involved with SEVA, and I'll say one more thing, if I may, which is look at the mainstreaming that has taken place. So 25, 30 years ago, microfinance was a developmental philanthropic activity aimed at vulnerable populations, poor women in Bangladesh, India, Latin America, Africa, right? So vulnerable populations. Today, it is a mainstream high-performing asset class. Microfinance portfolios, there are now microfinance banks, there are microfinance non-bank finance companies which are listed. Microfinance portfolios have some of the lowest PAR portfolio at risk metrics, right? So it's the mainstreaming that has taken place. We need to see similar mainstreaming take place. First, a rushing in and a crowding in of capital, supported by catalytic capital like Rockefeller, like governments, like GAP, but then bringing in private capital for scaling up commercial and commercializable large-scale solutions, which then creates mainstreaming. And then it creates the virtuous cycle where, because of mainstreaming, all populations' needs are addressed.
Right. Thank you, Anjali. So we're actually at the very close end of our session. So before we wrap up, I have a final question for you, With 2023 being named the Year of Sustainability in the UAE, I'd like to ask you each to please share in one word how you would describe the future of sustainability. Anjali, could you start, please?
Sustainability is the next digital. It's here.
Great, thank you. And William, one word, the future of sustainability.
Yeah, I think I'm going to take a few more than one word, if I may. I think that sustainability is a word that means many different things to different people. I think we need convergence around what sustainability means, and I think we need to align with the private sector. I think it's estimated that Africa alone will need $300 billion a year by 2030 to just to do adaptation and mitigation and just energy transitions. That money is not going to come from governments. It's not going to come from multilateral development banks. It's going to come from the private sector. And I think when we talk about sustainability, we've got to align what government thinks sustainability is, what private sector thinks sustainability is, and certainly what we in development think sustainability is. We have to align with the private sector. We've got to access that capital that is available. And like Anjali said, new products, have to come up that align with that new definition of sustainability. Thank you.
Excellent. So with that, I'd like to conclude. So thank you so much to our esteemed guests for your valuable insights today. And I would also like to thank the audience for tuning in and mention that if you want to watch the entire session, it will be posted on the Zayed Sustainability Prizes YouTube channel. So happy belated Earth Day, everyone. And we look forward to the year of COP28 and scaling up all of these solutions. Thank you. Bye.